Hello and welcome to Seeking Gnosis. My name is Danny and this video is going to be about cognitive typology and the implicit philosophies of the judging functions, which are feeling and thinking. So let's get into it. The four judging functions in Jungian typology are basically different ways of making sense of the reality that we live in. They're different ways of understanding our lives rather than just experiencing them. So I imagine that if type didn't exist, if every single person used the same cognitive functions in the same way, then everyone would have the same basic worldview, the same philosophy towards life. But fortunately, there is diversity in the cognitive functions that people prefer to use and engage the world with. So our world is full of different ideologies, philosophies, religions, value and belief systems. So your cognitive types, the cognitive functions you prefer to use, influence the personal philosophy that you accept, but they are not obviously the only factor because we all grow up in a society. So we are conditioned, programmed by our culture. We inherit certain philosophies. So it might be a religious doctrine that is explicitly taught to you as a child, or maybe a secular philosophy you're taught in school, or maybe it's just implicitly presupposed in everything that anyone says around you, and so you come to believe certain things simply because everyone assumes them around you. So a person's personal philosophy is the interaction between their innate cognitive type and the philosophies that they're exposed to throughout their lives. So in this video, I want to explore the different philosophies of the judging functions and how different types interact with different kinds of philosophy. So let's first review how the judging functions work. Carl Jung called them the rational functions because, unlike the irrational perceiving functions, which simply accept and store information, the judging functions actually do something with the information. So if you think of a function in math, it has an input and an output. So you input a number or a variable and you get an output. The same principle applies with the judging functions. So the input for a judging function is the information that the perceiving functions gather and store. So this includes physical objects, abstract ideas, people, events, utterances of speech, basically anything that we can perceive with the senses or our imagination. The output of a judging function is, unsurprisingly, a judgment. It's a decision about the input. It kind of attaches to the input some kind of evaluation about how this thing relates to other things. Feeling makes a judgment about the input in terms of its subjective value. So as I mentioned in my last video, the feeling function uses emotions to measure the value of something. The feeling function is humane. It's concerned with the experience of conscious living subjects. So it determines the value of something based on how it affects subjects. So for example, if a new technology comes out, then the feeling function will consider things like how this new technology is going to affect people's lives, how it's going to make them feel, affect their mood, their relationships. Also, if producing the technology harms the workers or the environment. These are all things that the feeling function is evaluating to come to a conclusion about this technology, which in this case is the input of the feeling function. So the value of the technology is its role within the web of life, of living things. So why do we have the feeling function as humans? Why did it evolve? Well, because it allows us to know what is good for our survival and how we can live good lives, basically. Thinking makes a judgment about the input in terms of its objective properties. So it comes to a conclusion about the mechanical causes and effects of things that happen in the world. So it evaluates the universe or nature as if it were just full of different inanimate objects that are interacting with each other in a deterministic way, following universal laws, physical, biological, chemical, mathematical laws. Um, so it seeks to break down the universe into different parts to understand how the different parts interact. So going back to the example of a new technology, the thinking function is considering things like how the technology works, what are the actual internal mechanisms that make it work, and how does it interact with other technologies, other systems, what are the resources that are used to make it. These are the kinds of things that the thinking function considers. So why do we have the thinking function? Why did it evolve? Well, because it allows us to manipulate nature to our benefit. Thinking doesn't really provide motivation by itself, but it provides the how to get what we want. So for example, if you see a tree with fruit high up that looks like it's delicious and nutritious, and you can use thinking to figure out how to get the fruit. Use a tool, build a ladder, use understanding of physics and how things work in the world to get what you want. That's what thinking really gives you. Everyone uses both of these functions, at least to some extent. If thinking or feeling is your dominant function, then you probably repress or neglect the other one, but that doesn't mean you don't use it. However, there is variety among the types because we can use both of these functions with either an introverted or extroverted attitude. So introverted judging is a subjective process in that it refers to the subject's experiences and knowledge. It refers to the inner world of the psyche to form conclusions. Extroverted judging, on the other hand, is an objective process because it refers to the external world, to consensus reality, in order to form conclusions. When feeling is introverted, then it's essentially making a subjective evaluation of subjective value. The introverted feeling type develops within their mind over time a set of personal values that are internally consistent, that don't have conflicts among them. They use these values to navigate their lives and maintain their integrity. So every new value judgment is integrated into a long history of value judgments. This tends to make introverted feeling types have a philosophy of personal moral responsibility or virtue-based ethics. They are usually sympathetic to another person if that person is following their own values, even if they don't align exactly with their values. So, in this view, an action is moral if the person who performs the action is acting according to their own beliefs, if they're being true to their values, regardless of the consequences of their actions. When feeling is extroverted, then it's making an objective evaluation of subjective value. So it's still considering the effect of something on subjects, but it's determining this value by looking at the external world, by seeing what's really going on. And unlike the inner world of the introverted functions, where things change very slowly because everything is integrated, the new into the old, the external world is constantly changing. So what was appropriate and good 5 years ago isn't necessarily appropriate today. Values need to be updated with the new context. So FE types, I think, tend to gravitate towards a philosophy of moral consequentialism. So in this view, an action is considered moral if it has good consequences in the world. If it makes people feel good, if it creates harmony, then it is a good thing, regardless of the intention of whoever performed the action. So maybe they intended to cause harm, but they ended up actually helping, so what they did was a good thing in this view. Now, I want to reiterate that I'm not suggesting that all FE types are moral consequentialists. Maybe they grew up in an environment where introverted feeling was more valued and they picked up a different kind of philosophy. But I do think there is a tendency. So I am an FE type, I'm INFJ, and I've definitely tended to view things in more of a consequentialist way, but I've also, believed that intent was important and recognized that other people had different values and they should take them into account. So, like I said, it's an interaction of nature and nurture. When thinking is extroverted, then it's making an objective evaluation of objective properties. So it seeks to understand the mechanical causes and effects in the world by referencing the external world, by seeing how things work in the world. So if someone makes a proposition about how something works, that proposition is judged as true and accurate if it can be put into practice, if it can be viewed and observed in the world. So, for example, if someone says, if I drop this ball from a certain height, it's going to reach the ground in exactly this amount of time according to this equation. And using extroverted thinking, you can judge if that's true by actually trying it out, by doing an experiment, seeing how long it takes, and if the reasoning was correct, then that explanation is accepted as true. So it's basically like, the scientific method. That's extroverted thinking. So extroverted thinking types, I think, tend to have a philosophy of pragmatism. They value ideas, explanations, only if they can be put to use in some way, if they have some practical application. When thinking is introverted, then it is essentially making a subjective evaluation of objective properties. So the TI type develops within their psyche over time a theoretical model of how things work, how nature works. So every new logical judgment that they make is integrated into this history and this model that they have constructed within their mind. So if someone makes a proposition about how something works, then the TI type can judge it as true if it's congruent with their theory. If they don't have any knowledge or experiences that contradict this proposition, then it can be accepted, at least until contradicting evidence is provided. Um, so I think this gives TI types a tendency to have a very logical philosophy in life. They feel responsible to know what makes sense to them, to be able to tell truth from falsehood with logical deduction. And generally, unless they know much about type, expect that other people have their own theory of how things work on a fundamental level. It seems to me that using the FITE axis seems like the most natural way of thinking for a human if they're concerned with their own survival and well-being, because the subjective factor of value is tied to the subjective reasoning process of introverted judging, and the objective factor of logic is tied to the objective reasoning process of extroverted judging. The opposite axis of FETI is kind of paradoxical because the subjective factor value is tied to the objective reasoning process of extroverted judging, while the objective factor of logic is tied to the subjective reasoning process of introverted judging. So while FITE is kind of seems the most natural way to um, take care of your own needs, get your own needs met, FETI seems to be more collectively focused. And I think FETI types tend to really value social progress and have a kind of more universal perspective. So now I want to share some examples from my own experience of how people of different types have either accepted or rejected, embraced different kinds of philosophy. So I grew up in the Mormon Church, which is a very kind of high demand religion, very fundamentalist in a lot of ways. And the Mormon Church makes claims not only about what is morally right and wrong, but also about like the physical world and how it works, like, how the world was created and everything. Because they have a very literal interpretation of the Bible and the other scriptures that they use. So I actually left the Mormon Church in my early 20s, and several of my family members and friends have also left, though many still remain active members. And it's been interesting to me to see kind of the relationship that different types of people have had with the religion. So, my first example is a family member of mine whose type is ESFJ. So, her dominant cognitive function is extroverted feeling. And this person, shortly after graduating from high school and moving away from home, decided to stop participating in the church. And her reason for doing so, as far as she's explained to me, is basically just that she saw that the church's beliefs and practices were causing suffering to a lot of people that she knew, especially members of the LGBT community, and racial minorities, women. She just saw that it had a negative effect on lots of people. And I think she had some bad experiences too, and some good ones. But it doesn't seem like it was a very personal thing. It was more just that she saw that it caused harm, and so she didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. So she stopped believing in it. And she didn't really need to be convinced with arguments, with logic, evidence about, the church's truth claims or anything like that. She just saw that it wasn't good and decided that it wasn't for her. My personal experience, however, was a bit different. So my type is INFJ. So I also use extroverted feeling, but it's more balanced with introverted thinking. So introverted thinking is more valued for me, and it's been pretty dominant in my psyche despite being my third function. And so the emotional effects of the religion on people was always important to me, but I also had a strong belief in the church's teachings because the way it had been explained to me, been taught to me, made sense. It was logically consistent for the most part. And this is because the church had been working pretty hard over the last few decades to present a consistent narrative and to silence the critics and to cover up any information that contradicted what they said. And so I had a pretty strong belief and felt like I had things figured out. So ultimately, it was kind of ethical FE concerns that started making me question things. I realized that the church was causing me to suffer and other people I knew because I was gay. I mean, I am gay. And being gay and Mormon, it's not easy. They don't accept homosexuality like most other conservative Christian religions. And so, I eventually realized that I didn't agree that homosexuality was sinful because I didn't see that it was harming anyone. And so that got me questioning and opening my mind a little bit. But it wasn't really until I was exposed to enough information about all the contradictions within the church's teachings, and there are plenty when you actually look for them and are willing to consider them. And so once I learned that information, I was able to actually definitively say, okay, no, I don't believe in this anymore. And that change in my belief was a pretty difficult transition because I felt like I went from having everything sort of figured out, I had all the answers to the important questions of life, to feeling like I didn't really know much of anything. It was kind of scary. But eventually I realized that I did have certain beliefs, certain understandings of the world based on my experience and things I had learned outside of the church that I could rely on. So I kind of feel like leaving the church helped me discover my own introverted thinking abilities and my own way to know what is true and what is false based on logic. That's an interesting aspect of religion, I think, because when you accept an externally defined system of values or beliefs, then you kind of outsource your own judgment to someone else. So rather than relying on your own emotional and logical intelligence to make ethical and logical decisions, you rely on these decisions that other people have made, maybe a long time ago. And I think that that might even complicate determining someone's type sometimes if they are religious. Because, someone, for example, might seem like an introverted feeler because they're very concerned with being true to moral principles. But it could be that their innate preference is actually for extroverted feeling, but they've been indoctrinated into a religion that highly values, that has very specifically defined moral values that they're expected to uphold. And I don't mean to say that this is true of all religions or all religious people, but I think it does happen. I also know a couple of ISFPs who have also left Mormonism, and for them the process seems to have been a bit different. Having a preference for introverted feeling, it's their dominant function, it was more of an inner battle between their personal values and emotional experience and what they had been taught and what they were getting from the church. So it wasn't so much a concern for, the effects that the church is having objectively, but just with their own experience, whether it was allowing them to be true to themselves or not. And both of these people that I'm talking about are also gay, so there was plenty of mismatch between their own feelings and what the church teaches. But I've also known some other people that I believe are FITE using types, and they are still staunchly loyal to the church. Even maybe if they've seen plenty of logical, convincing arguments against the church, they continue to believe in it because they hold fast to these values they've internalized. And if they don't have enough really personal, deep experience that causes conflict there, then they, are comfortable staying with it. Another example that I thought of, this time from pop culture, is the character of Robert Hansen in the series Grace and Frankie, which is a great series, by the way. But Robert, I believe, is an ISTJ, and so he's on the FITE axis. And even though he comes out of the closet as gay and marries a man in his 70s, he still holds on to his Catholic faith. He's had all these experiences and he's developed these values that are based on so many decades in the Catholic Church that, at least to some degree, worked for him or probably, helped him in some situations. So even though the church doesn't accept homosexuality, he still retains that belief, still goes to mass and everything. So I think that shows, his strong FI values that are also tied to his dominant introverted sensing, all these experiences, these concrete memories that he identifies with strongly. So I thought that was another good example of, especially when you have SI and FI together, that you don't easily update your value system. I think it's also interesting to look at a culture at large to see which function predominates and what kind of philosophy that creates. And if you look at the United States today, I mean, there are many subcultures, but I think in general, extroverted thinking definitely dominates our culture. You are really respected as a person if you can use your thinking to produce something, to make some kind of product. Our education system is based on, the results that you can produce with your thinking. And I think you can see this in academia, at least in some fields. Extroverted thinking is valued much more than introverted thinking. You're expected to do lots of experiments or show how your research can be applied in some way. And everything is very fast paced. You're expected to produce a lot, and they don't give you much time to actually integrate, to do some introverted thinking of connecting things and coming up with a theory that can connect many different pieces of research. Some people really scoff at armchair philosophers that rather than doing more, collecting more data, doing more experiments, just sit and integrate and think about how we can explain what's already been found. And I think that's quite a shame. And I think a lot of introverted thinking types kind of struggle in our education system to really follow their passion because they're expected to keep up with all the extroverted thinking types that are just moving and doing a lot of stuff without taking the time to integrate it all. I think you can also see this in our political and economic system. There's definitely a bias towards extroverted thinking or the TEFI axis. Individuals are expected to be responsible for regulating their own behavior, making good choices as far as the products that they buy and the candidates that they vote for. It's very individually based rather than collectively based. And I do think that's kind of shifting a little bit. There's more extroverted feeling that I think is surging in our culture as more people see that we can't just leave it up to individuals to be responsible. We need to actually define some common values so that we can make sure we have a fair society. We live in such a complex world that just expecting everyone to make moral decisions if they don't necessarily have the best options to begin with is problematic. So it's interesting to see how that plays out in a culture. That's all for this video on the philosophies of the judging functions. If you thought of some more examples from your own life, from pop culture, or anything that you want to share, please leave it down in the comments. Or if you have a question about the functions or you disagree with something I said, please leave a comment. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. I will hopefully be posting some more videos soon. Thanks for listening and have a fabulous day.